It's a good idea to clean the threads thoroughly. To begin installation of the new bottom bracket assembly, you'll start by installing the right bearing cup into the frame completely. Don't forget that the right bearing cup is reverse threaded, so you will need to turn it counterclockwise to install it into the frame. Once the bearing cup is installed completely, use the bottom bracket tool to tighten the cup against the frame. Now that you've installed the right bearing cup into the frame, the next step will be to install the spindle. Pay particular attention on the spindle to which side goes to the drive side, which would be the long side of the shaft sticking out. That's the side you want to stick through that will actually go on the crank arm. So go ahead and install it into the frame. This can be kind of difficult because it is a kind of a pressed fit in there. Now that you've installed the spindle, you will continue by starting the left bearing cup into the frame. This one you will need to turn clockwise to get it started into the frame. Be very careful as the threads in the frame are very, very small, and if you damage them, then you have to replace the whole frame. The next step is very crucial in the process of rebuilding your bottom bracket assembly. We're going to install the lock ring, but we need to make sure that the bottom bracket is adjusted correctly before we lock that lock ring into place. Start by installing the lock ring, but don't torque it all the way down to the frame yet. It may be necessary to hold the bottom bracket tool in the cup while threading the lock ring on. To properly adjust the bottom bracket, continue to tighten the bearing cup with the bottom bracket tool while you're spinning the spindle from the opposite side of the bike. Once you feel the spindle stopping because of the torque you're putting on that bearing, back the bearing cup off just enough so that the spindle will still spin freely. Once you feel like you've got the proper adjustment, you'll hold the bottom bracket tool in the left side bearing cup while torquing the lock ring onto the bike. Once you've got the lock ring tight, you can remove the bottom bracket tool and continue to torque the lock ring. To make sure you get the proper torque on your lock ring, using the lock ring tool and a piece of cloth or something soft, tighten the lock ring. Spin the spindle again to make sure that the spindle will spin freely. To further verify the adjustment of your bottom bracket assembly, using a rubber mallet, tap lightly on both ends of the spindle to make sure there's not any free play from side to side. If during inspection you continually find that your bearing cups are coming loose, it may be useful to apply a few drops of medium Loctite to each bearing cup before assembly. These are the parts we have left to reinstall. Before installing the crank arm bolt, be sure that there is some Loctite applied to the bolt's threads. New bolts will generally come with them, but if they do not, you do need to apply it. If you're reusing an old crank arm bolt, you definitely want to use Loctite. The proper way to use this Loctite is to apply it to the threads and then wait 5 or 10 minutes and then install it into the bike. Since our bolt came pre-Loctited, we can just put it into the bike. Install the crank arm bolt as far as you can at this point. We'll come back and torque it once we get the complete assembly installed. Leave the left side crank arm at the bottom of its stroke and install the right crank arm with the pedal at the top of its stroke as shown in the video here. Once you've installed the crank arm by hand, install the crank arm bolt. Now that you've installed both crank arms and you are sure that the pedals are in the proper position, the next step is to install the drive belt back onto the bike. To do this, you'll simply put the drive belt on the front smaller pulley of the flywheel, route it under the tension idler, over the pedal, and onto the pulley. Now slowly turn the crank arm counterclockwise, and this will force the belt onto the bike. You want to make sure that the belt is lined up and that the grooves on the pulley are lined up completely with the grooves on the belt. Improper installation of your belt can damage the belt quite quickly. To properly torque the crank arm bolts It may make the process easier to use the brake tension and the flywheel to hold pressure against the crank arms. To do this, spin the brake tension knob assembly down until the flywheel will not spin. Once you have the flywheel locked out, use a torque wrench that is set to 30 foot-pounds to tighten the crank arm bolts. The first type of torque wrench we're using is a click style. Continue to tighten the crank arm bolt until the torque wrench clicks. Clicking lets you know that the torque has been achieved that the wrench is set to. Now we will demonstrate using a beam style torque wrench. Again, you're looking for 30 foot-pounds. Because the scale on our torque wrench shows inch-pounds, we're going to do 360 inch-pounds. The next step is to torque the crank arm bolt on the left side. Use a torque wrench, and you're going to want to get 30 foot-pounds. Continue to tighten the bolt until the wrench clicks. Here we're demonstrating the beam style torque wrench again. 30 foot-pounds is what we're looking for. To test drive belt tension, mount the bike and stand on the pedals and try to make the pedals slip. If the belt slips, it needs tension. A small, tiny amount of slippage is okay. It's very important that you don't over-tighten the belt. Belts will stretch over time, and you may need to come back and do this adjustment process again. If you cannot make the belt slip, the belt is properly tensioned. Once your drive belt is properly tensioned, tighten the tension idler using the 7/8 inch wrench. The final step in the process is to replace the belt cover. Reinstall the drive belt cover bolts. When installing the drive belt cover, don't forget to reinstall the Phillips head screws from the back side. This completes the procedure.